The rain fell in sheets, cold and relentless, mirroring the downpour inside her. Ilara huddled deeper beneath the inadequate shelter of a thick pine, the rough bark pressing against her back. Her cloak, soaked through hours ago, clung to her like a shroud. Tears tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks, mingling with the cold spray from the branches above. She was alone. Terribly, utterly alone. The forest, dense and indifferent, seemed to press in on her, its gloomy silence broken only by the drumming rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. Weeks ago, her world had been smaller, contained within the rough-hewn walls of their cabin. It hadn't been a perfect world, not by any stretch, but it had been hers. It had held Thomas, his quiet strength, a steady anchor against the vast, indifferent land. It had held the promise of a future, small and uncertain, but theirs together. Then, the fever had taken him. Swiftly, brutally, leaving her numb and adrift in the sudden silence of the cabin. Grief had hollowed her out, a physical ache beneath her ribs. She hadn't been able to stay. The cabin was a tomb of memories, every object a sharp reminder of what was lost. The nearby settlement offered little solace, only pitying glances and the unspoken question of how a woman alone would survive the coming winter. Some offered platitudes, others thinly veiled warnings about the dangers of the frontier. None offered genuine help, not the kind she needed. Her small store of money dwindled. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her sorrow. She sold what she could, packed a meager bundle, and simply walked away, following a vague notion of reaching a distant town, though the miles stretched ahead like an impassable chasm. The forest had seemed a daunting but perhaps faster route, a tangled wilderness that promised concealment from judging eyes if nothing else. But the rain had come, and with it, despair. She was lost, cold, and her small supply of food was running low. The future she'd fled towards felt less like a destination and more like another form of endless, empty distance. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, burying her face in her arms, trying to shut out the relentless chill and the crushing weight of her isolation. The forest floor was a bed of damp leaves and mud, seeping through her worn trousers. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the profound vulnerability that clawed at her. What little strength she had possessed seemed to have drained away with the rain. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes stinging, she saw him. He was a shadow against the shadows of the trees, standing perhaps 20 yards away, a native man. Tall, lean, wrapped in deerskin and what looked like a faded blanket, his hair dark and wet against a strong, angular face. He held a rifle, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the weak light. His eyes, dark and steady, watched her. There was no expression she could decipher, no threat, but no obvious comfort either. Just watching. Ilara froze, every instinct screaming danger. The stories she'd heard in the settlement, whispered around crackling fires on cold nights, flooded her mind. Tales of raids, of violence, of savages. Fear, primal and sharp, cut through her grief. She couldn't run, her legs felt like lead. She could only stare back, her breath catching in her throat, waiting. He didn't move. The rain slicked his hair, dripped from the brim of the soft leather hat he wore. He was still, unnervingly still, like another part of the ancient forest itself. The silence stretched, thick and heavy between them, punctuated only by the continued drumming of the rain on leaves and the pounding pulse in her ears. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. He didn't rest it against a tree or sling it over his shoulder. He simply held it pointed downwards, a gesture that seemed less aggressive, though not overtly welcoming. Then, even more slowly, he turned his head, glancing at the sky, then back at her. He raised a hand, pointing away, deeper into the woods. She didn't understand. Was he telling her to leave, to go in that direction? Her mind, clouded by fear and exhaustion, struggled to process his silent message. She swallowed, her throat dry. He took a single step towards her, then stopped, seemingly assessing her reaction. When she flinched almost imperceptibly, he stopped again, his body language conveying a strange mix of caution and something else she couldn't name. He pointed again, his gesture more insistent this time, then turned his back to her, walking slowly in the direction he'd indicated. He didn't look back, he simply moved, disappearing into the dense undergrowth as silently as he had appeared. Panic warred with a flicker of something else, curiosity perhaps, or a desperate, irrational hope. What did he want? Was this a trap? The stories warned of treachery, but he hadn't attacked. He had shown himself, lowered his weapon, and pointed the way, away from the open, rain-lashed space she occupied, towards what? She hesitated for a long moment, the cold rain seeping into her bones. Staying put offered only continued misery and exposure. Going with him was a risk, a terrifying one, but maybe, just maybe, it offered a chance. A chance at shelter, at warmth, at something other than dying alone and cold in the woods. The sheer weight of her despair tilted the scales. She had nothing left to lose. Gathering her soaked cloak tighter, Ilara pushed herself to her feet. Her legs ached, stiff from the cold. She gripped her small bundle and started walking, following the barely discernible path he had taken, her heart still hammering against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and desperate hope in the sodden silence of the forest. She walked for what felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. The forest floor grew thicker with pine needles, cushioning her steps. The warrior remained just ahead, a silent guide she could occasionally glimpse through the trees. He maintained a steady pace, neither rushing nor lingering, as if certain she would follow. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sounds of the forest began to assert themselves over the rain, the rustle of unseen creatures, the creak of branches in the wind. Ilara felt a strange mixture of terror and awe. She was utterly dependent on this silent, unknown man, following him deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind the last vestiges of the life she had known. They reached a small clearing, partially sheltered by a cluster of ancient towering trees. At the edge of the clearing was a small, low structure, dug partly into the side of a gentle slope, covered with sod and branches. A wisp of smoke curled lazily from a small opening in the roof. A dwelling. Simple, almost hidden, but undeniably shelter. He stopped just outside the entrance and stepped aside, a silent invitation. Ilara approached cautiously, her hand hovering near the small knife she kept tucked into her boot, a useless weapon against a rifle, but a small comfort nonetheless. The entrance was low, requiring her to stoop. Inside, the air was warmer, dry, and thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something earthy and unfamiliar. A small fire crackled in a central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the packed earth walls. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, but it felt enormous compared to the oppressive wilderness outside. Skins covered parts of the floor, and a few simple wooden bowls and tools lay near the fire. The warrior entered behind her, closing the low entrance with a woven mat. The sudden dimness, punctuated only by the firelight, was startling. He moved towards the fire, kneeling without a sound, and added a few small pieces of wood. The flames licked higher, chasing away more of the gloom. He didn't speak, didn't look at her directly for a long moment. He just tended the fire, his movements economical and purposeful. Ilara stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure what to do, where to look. She felt exposed, vulnerable, even inside this small, warm space. Finally, he stirred. Without a word, he gestured towards the opposite side of the fire from where he sat. It was an invitation to sit, to share the warmth. Hesitantly, Ilara moved forward, sinking onto the soft deerskin. The heat from the fire was a revelation, easing the deep chill in her bones. She held her hands out, letting the warmth soak into her frozen fingers. She risked a glance at him. He was watching the fire, his face impassive in the flickering light. She noticed a cut on his cheek, dark against his skin, and a tear in the fabric of his blanket near his shoulder. He wasn't untouched by hardship either. He reached for one of the wooden bowls, dipped it into a clay pot near the fire, and offered it to her. It held a thick, fragrant stew. Her stomach rumbled, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet space. Hunger, long suppressed by grief and fear, asserted itself fiercely. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. He gave a slight nod, his eyes meeting hers for just a fleeting second. In that brief exchange, she saw not judgment, but perhaps a flicker of recognition, or simply the quiet acknowledgement of one human to another in a harsh world. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had received in weeks. She ate slowly, savoring the warm, savory stew. It tasted of roots, perhaps some small game. It was the best thing she had eaten since Thomas died. He ate, too, from his own bowl, slowly and silently. When they finished, he took her bowl and set it aside with his. He then rose and, with surprising gentleness, gestured towards a pile of softer skins in a corner away from the fire. It was clearly meant for her. Ilara hesitated. Sleeping in the same small space as a stranger, a man from a culture she had been taught to fear, it felt wrong, dangerous. But the fatigue was a heavy cloak, and the prospect of sleeping in warmth and dryness was intoxicating. She looked at him. He offered no pressure, no expectation, just the quiet offer of rest. "Are you?" she began, then stopped, unsure how to ask. Was he staying? Was this his home? Was she a prisoner? He seemed to understand her unspoken question. He shook his head slowly, indicating that he would not join her there. He would stay by the fire. The gesture was clear, respectful. With a grateful, weary sigh, Ilara moved to the skins. They were soft and smelled faintly of smoke and wilderness. She lay down, still fully clothed but feeling the luxury of dry warmth against her skin. She watched him for a moment by the fire. He sat cross-legged, his rifle leaning against the wall nearby, his profile etched against the firelight. He wasn't watching her. He was simply present, a silent, watchful presence in the small dwelling. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, the first true rest she'd had since the fever took Thomas. She slept feeling vulnerable, yet strangely, inexplicably, safe. The next morning the rain had stopped. The forest outside shimmered, alive with the scent of wet earth and pine needles catching the sparse morning light. Ilara woke to find the warrior gone from his spot by the fire. A small fire still glowed, and a pot of water sat warming beside it. She sat up, stretching muscles stiff from days of travel and cold. The stew from the night before had settled her stomach, giving her a fragile thread of strength. She stepped outside the dwelling. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the sounds of birdsong she hadn't heard in the rain. He was there, standing a short distance away, looking out at the forest. He turned when she emerged, his gaze steady as ever. "Good morning," she said, feeling awkward. He inclined his head slightly, still silent. They shared a silent breakfast of some dried berries he produced from a small pouch. The language barrier felt immense, a wall built of silence and difference. Yet a strange kind of communication began to emerge, built on shared glances, gestures, and the simple necessity of their shared space. He showed her how to collect firewood, his movements precise and efficient. She, in turn, found water at a nearby stream he indicated and boiled it over the fire. They worked in comfortable silence, each aware of the other's presence, a rhythm developing between them that required no words. Days turned into a week. Ilara learned his routines. He spent much of the day hunting or checking traps, returning usually at dusk. He was skilled, providing small game or fish for them to eat. He was also watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the woods, his ears alert to every sound. It was clear he was a man who lived close to the land and close to danger. She learned his silence wasn't empty. It was a silence filled with observation, with listening, with a deep understanding of the world around him. He seemed to absorb everything without needing to name it. He didn't ask about her. He didn't ask why she was alone in the forest, tearful and lost. His lack of questions was a kindness, a quiet acceptance of her presence without demanding an explanation she wasn't ready to give. One evening, sitting by the fire, she found herself talking. The words tumbled out, hesitant at first, then gaining speed, about Thomas, their life together, the fever, the cabin, the gnawing loneliness that had driven her into the woods. She spoke to the fire, to the shadows, rarely looking at him. He listened, silently, his gaze fixed on the flames. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. When she finished, the silence returned, but it felt different this time. It wasn't empty, it was filled with the echoes of her words, held and acknowledged. He reached out and gently added a small piece of wood to the fire, a simple act that felt like a quiet affirmation, a nonverbal acknowledgement of her pain. From that night, the dynamic shifted subtly. The wall of silence didn't crumble entirely, but small stones began to loosen. Sometimes he would point to a bird and make a soft, trilling sound that mimicked its call. Or he would show her how to identify a particular plant, its uses, his gestures clear and instructive. She, in turn, shared stories of her life before the frontier, of a world so different from this one, weaving tales he listened to with quiet intensity. She learned his name, or the name he used, Kalen. He finally spoke it one evening, pointing to himself, a deep, resonant sound she repeated hesitantly. Kalen. It suited his quiet strength. Trust, a fragile seedling, began to sprout in the fertile ground of shared need and quiet respect. Ilara felt a sense of safety she hadn't known since Thomas was alive. Kalen was a constant, unwavering presence, his silent watchfulness a shield around their small, hidden world. She stopped flinching at his sudden appearance, learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight inclination of his head, the steady gaze of his dark eyes. Their connection deepened in quiet ways. One cold morning, he found a wild rose blooming late and brought it to her, placing it gently in her hand. Another time she mended a tear in his blanket with her own thread, her fingers surprisingly steady. They were small gestures, but they spoke volumes in their silent world. But the peace of their hidden existence was fragile. The world outside the forest hadn't forgotten them, or rather, it hadn't forgotten him. One afternoon, Kalen returned looking more withdrawn than usual. His silence felt heavier, laced with a tension she hadn't felt before. He moved with a coiled alertness, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. That evening, as dusk settled, they heard it. The distant baying of dogs, and voices, white men's voices, angry, shouting. Kalen's head snapped up, his body rigid. He extinguished the fire instantly, plunging the dwelling into near-total darkness. He moved swiftly, pressing himself against the earth wall near the entrance, listening. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear, cold and sharp, returned, different this time. Not the fear of dying alone, but the fear of being discovered, of Kalen being discovered. The story she had heard in the settlement about the animosity towards native people returned with chilling clarity. They wouldn't see him as a man who had saved her. They would see him as a threat, perhaps accuse him of kidnapping her. The sounds grew closer, the snapping of twigs, the labored breathing of men moving through the rough terrain. The dogs whined, sniffing the air, their baying growing more excited. Kalen moved swiftly to her side, his hand gently but firmly covering her mouth, a silent command for silence. He held her there, pressed against the cool earth, his body a shield between her and the sound of the approaching threat. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the readiness for danger that was etched into his very being. The voices were clearer now, rough and angry. They came this way, Jedediah, I'm sure of it. That redskin ain't far, and maybe that woman's with him. Heard she ran off into the woods like a scared rabbit. If she's with him, she's a traitor, or worse. We'll handle them both. Ilara's blood ran cold. They knew she was gone. They suspected Kalen. The casual cruelty in their voices was terrifying. These were the people she had lived near, whose pity she had fled. Now, their prejudice had turned to active pursuit. The dogs were closer still, right outside the dwelling, their frantic sniffing and whining audible through the sod roof. One barked sharply, right outside the entrance. Kalen tensed beside her. He was silent, deadly still, but she felt the raw power held in check, the instinct of a hunter, a warrior, preparing to defend his territory, his companion. A voice boomed from outside. Hello, anyone in there? We saw smoke earlier. You got a woman in there? Ilara, it's Jedediah. We're here to help. The offer of help was laced with a threat, a chilling insincerity. Ilara wanted to scream, to tell them she was safe, that Kalen was her protector. But Kalen's hand remained firm on her mouth, his eyes meeting hers in the near darkness. In his gaze, she saw not fear for himself, but a fierce, protective resolve directed solely at her. He was telling her, without words, that silence was their only weapon now. He slowly, carefully, released her mouth. He moved towards the low entrance, knife drawn. He wasn't going to hide, he was going to face them. Panic flared in Ilara's chest. She grabbed his arm, whispering frantically, No, Kalen, don't. There are too many. They'll kill you. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. He gently placed his free hand on her cheek, a gesture of profound tenderness in the face of imminent violence. Then his gaze flickered towards the back wall of the dwelling. It was a silent question, a silent plan. There was a small opening there, barely visible, a secondary escape route he had shown her, but never mentioned using. He wasn't going to fight them all head-on inside the confined space. He was going to draw them out, create a diversion, give her a chance to escape. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a silent goodbye, or perhaps a silent wait. Then, with a deep breath that she felt rather than heard, he pushed aside the woven mat and emerged into the twilight, knife in hand, a lone figure stepping out to face the baying dogs and angry men. "Jedediah," he called out, his voice surprisingly strong, devoid of fear, though accented and deep. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak more than a single word. The sound was powerful, startling, a challenge thrown into the tense air. There was a moment of stunned silence from the men outside. They hadn't expected him to emerge, or to speak their language, however imperfectly. "Well, looky here," a voice sneered. "Thought you'd hide, Redskin. And where's the woman? Did you kill her?" "She's safe," Kalen replied, his voice steady. "She not here." Lies, spoken to protect her. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. He was risking everything for her, the woman he had found crying in the rain. "You're lying," Jedediah shouted, anger flaring. "Get him, boys. Check the shack." There was a scramble outside. Dogs barked, men shouted. Ilara heard the sounds of movement around the dwelling, the rough handling of the entrance mat. "Go," she heard Kalen shout, closer than she expected, near the back wall. His voice was raw with urgency. He was distracting them, drawing them towards him. This was her chance. With trembling hands, Ilara fumbled for the small opening Kalen had shown her. It was narrow, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. She pushed, scraping her shoulders and hips against the rough earth and roots, scrambling out into the damp, twilight air on the other side of the dwelling. She stayed low, hidden by thick bushes, listening. The sounds of struggle were intense now. Shouts, grunts, the clatter of metal against metal. Kalen was fighting them. One man against several. She could hear his sharp, indrawn breaths, the sounds of blows being struck. Fear paralyzed her for a moment, then a surge of fierce protectiveness, something new and potent, flooded through her. Kalen, he was her guardian. He had shown her kindness, given her safety, accepted her grief without judgment. She couldn't leave him, not now. She crawled forward, peering through the undergrowth towards the front of the dwelling. She saw figures moving in the dim light. Kalen was a whirlwind of motion, using his knife with desperate skill, dodging the clumsy swings of rifles and clubs. He moved like smoke, hard to pin down, but he was outnumbered, and they were relentless. She saw one man stumble, clutching his arm. Another cried out. Kalen fought like a cornered wolf, silent and deadly, his earlier calm shattered by the brutal necessity of survival. Then, Jedediah roared, "Get him down! Shoot him if you have to!" Shoot him! The word struck Ilara like a physical blow. No, she couldn't let that happen. She had to do something. Her eyes scanned the ground desperately, searching for anything that could help. Her hand closed around a loose, heavy rock. It was crude, but it was something. She scrambled out from behind the bushes, ignoring the scratch of thorns on her arms. "Leave him alone," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation, throwing the rock with all her might towards the figures grappling with Kalen. It wasn't a precise throw, but it landed with a thud nearby, momentarily distracting them. All heads turned towards her. "The woman," Jedediah snarled. "She's with him, I told you." Kalen used the momentary distraction. He broke free from the men, scrambling back towards the entrance of the dwelling, his chest heaving. "Go back," he yelled at Ilara, his voice strained. "Run." But she stood her ground, facing the group of angry men, her heart pounding, but her fear strangely muted by a rising tide of defiance. They represented the judgment, the narrow-mindedness, the cruelty she had fled. They saw difference as danger, vulnerability as weakness. Kalen, the silent warrior, had shown her more humanity than these men who claimed to be civilized. "He saved me," she shouted, stepping closer, putting herself between Kalen and the men. "He gave me shelter. He's not a threat." Laughter, harsh, ugly laughter. "Saved you, did he?" Jedediah sneered, advancing towards her. "Looks to me like he captured you, brainwashed you." "Step aside, woman. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Ilara retorted, her voice gaining strength. She might have been alone and grieving, but she wasn't weak. She wouldn't be intimidated. He is a good man, better than any of you. Leave this place. Leave him alone. Jedediah stopped, surprised by her defiance. He looked at Kaylin, standing defensively behind her, then back at Ilara, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. He raised his rifle. You're choosing a savage over your own kind? The words hung heavy in the air, a stark embodiment of the prejudice she had encountered, amplified by malice. This was the moment, the turning point. She could step aside, let them take Kaylin, return to a life of uncertain safety but undeniable loneliness and regret, or she could stand with him, against the world that judged them both. Kaylin moved then, stepping up beside her, his hand gripping her arm. His silence was gone, replaced by a fierce presence, a quiet power that emanated from him. She with me, he said, his voice low but carrying a rumble of warning. You go now, leave us. Jedediah hesitated, glancing at his men, who looked wary. Kaylin had already shown he was dangerous in a fight, and Ilara's unexpected, stubborn defense had complicated things. They hadn't expected the tearful, lost woman to stand against them, to openly side with the man they hunted. It shifted the narrative, made their claim of saving her look flimsy. A tense standoff ensued, punctuated by the whimpering of the dogs. The men shuffled their feet, uncertain. We ain't forgetting this, Jedediah finally spat, his eyes narrowed with malice. You'll regret this, Ilara. You'll regret choosing a heathen. He lowered his rifle slightly, a signal to his men. With sullen looks and muttered curses, they began to retreat, dragging their injured comrade, the dogs following, their tails tucked. Ilara watched them go, a wave of trembling sweeping through her now that the immediate danger had passed. The forest silence returned, deeper than before. She turned to Kaylin, her legs weak. He was watching the direction they had gone, his body still tense, but the fierce light in his eyes softening as he looked at her. You were brave, he said, his voice rough. You saved me, she replied, tears filling her eyes again, but these were tears of relief and a profound, unexpected gratitude. Again. He didn't reply with words, but he lifted his hand and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. It was a gesture of such simple, deep connection that it spoke louder than any pronouncement. They returned to the dwelling. The night was long, filled with a different kind of silence, not empty or tense, but watchful, shared. They sat by the rekindled fire, the events of the evening hanging between them, a crucible in which their bond had been tested and forged. They knew the men might return, or that others might come, drawn by the same prejudice and fear. Their small haven was no longer entirely secret. The next morning, Kaylin began packing his few belongings. Ilara watched him, her heart sinking. Was he leaving? Leaving her? Now, after everything? He finished packing, securing his rifle. He looked at her, his gaze steady. We must go, he said simply. Not safe here anymore. Ilara nodded, understanding, but where would they go? Back to the judgment of the settlements? Deeper into the unforgiving wilderness? Where? She asked, her voice small. He looked out towards the forest, towards the setting sun. West, he said. Further west, find a new place, a quiet place. He paused, then looked back at her, his expression unreadable, but his dark eyes held a question. You come? You come? The choice was hers. Return to the loneliness of the known, or venture into the uncertain future with this silent warrior who had become her unexpected protector, her anchor in the storm. There was no hesitation. The thought of losing his quiet presence, his steady watchfulness, his unexpected kindness, was unbearable. The life she had known was gone. The future she had fled towards offered nothing. This silent man, this outsider like herself in a way, offered not a return to the past, but a chance to build something new, together. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, I come. A flicker of something that might have been relief, or perhaps quiet satisfaction, crossed Kaylin's face. He nodded, a single, firm nod. They left the small, hidden dwelling, leaving behind the ashes of the fire and the ghosts of the recent conflict. The forest seemed different now, less gloomy, more like a path to somewhere else. They walked together, side by side, two figures moving into the vast, uncertain landscape of the American West. They didn't speak much, not at first. Their communication remained one of shared glances, understanding gestures, the quiet rhythm of two people moving together with a shared purpose. Kalen led the way, his knowledge of the land their guide. Ilara followed, her steps steadier now, her gaze fixed not on the ground in defeat, but on the horizon, on the promise of a future she hadn't imagined possible just weeks before. The journey was hard. The land was unforgiving, the weather unpredictable. They faced hunger, exhaustion, the constant threat of discovery or danger. But they faced it together. Kalen's silent strength was her shield, his resourcefulness their survival. Ilara, in turn, found a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to track small game, to identify edible plants, to move through the wilderness with a quiet confidence born of necessity and Kalen's unspoken tutelage. Their connection deepened with every shared hardship, every moment of quiet companionship by the fire, under a sky full of stars. The silence between them transformed from a barrier into a language of its own, filled with mutual respect, burgeoning affection, and a profound sense of belonging. Ilara no longer felt alone. She was with Kalen, and that felt like home. They found their quiet place finally, tucked away in a high mountain valley, accessible only by a narrow, winding path. It was a place of stunning, isolated beauty, surrounded by towering peaks and deep, silent forests. Here, far from the judging eyes of the settlements, they built a simple cabin. It was smaller than the one she had shared with Thomas, built from logs Kalen expertly felled and notched. Ilara worked beside him, learning to handle tools she had never touched before, her hands growing calloused but strong. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of hammer and saw, axe and rope, weaving a new kind of song into the mountain air. The first winter in their valley was harsh, testing their resolve. Snow piled high, cutting them off from the outside world. But the cabin was sturdy, the fire warm, and their larder, filled by Kalen's hunting and Ilara's careful preservation, was sufficient. They spent the long nights by the fire, Kalen teaching her the names of the constellations in his language, sharing quiet stories of his people, his past, his life before he found her in the rain. His voice, once a startling rarity, became a familiar comfort, though words were still used sparingly, each one carrying weight and meaning. Ilara shared more of her own life, her hopes, her fears. The grief for Thomas was still there, a quiet ache in her heart, but it was no longer a gaping wound. Kalen didn't try to replace him, but his presence filled the emptiness that loneliness had left behind. Their love grew slowly, like a hardy mountain flower pushing through rocky soil. It wasn't born of grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but of shared resilience, mutual protection, quiet understanding, and the simple, profound fact of their choosing to face the world together. It was a love built in the silence of the wilderness, strong and deep and true. The valley became their world, their sanctuary. They lived simply, tending a small garden in the summer, relying on the bounty of the land that Kalen knew so intimately. The prejudice of the world outside faded into a distant echo, replaced by the immediate realities of mountain living and the quiet strength of their bond. Ilara, once tearful and lost in the gloomy forest, was tearful no more. The sorrow remained a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She was a woman forged by loss and hardship, yes, but also by unexpected kindness, fierce loyalty, and the quiet, unwavering love of a silent warrior who had become her guardian angel, her partner, her home. Their life was not easy, but it was theirs, built on the foundation of two lonely souls finding each other in the vast, indifferent wilderness and choosing, every day, to belong together. The forest, once a place of overwhelming fear and despair, was now simply home. Its silence was their peace, its vastness their freedom. And in that quiet, shared world, Ilara finally found the healing and belonging she had unknowingly been searching for all along. The journey from a tearful, isolated figure in the rain to a woman standing strong and loved in her mountain valley had been long and arduous, but every step, every silent moment shared, every challenge overcome, had led her here, to this earned peace, this profound connection.